Hi, my name's John Mortimer, and I'm going to go through what relational public services are and how to apply human learning systems. The way that I'm going to do that is to use a case study, and I'm going to use lots of evidence from the last 2 decades. And the thing about public services today is that we know that it's not the best way to design them. We know that because we have increasing costs, we have spiraling demands, and we have evidence of scores of redesigns that we have tried to do in the public sector, not just in the UK, but across the world. And we've seen evidence of what better ways of working can actually be. And that's what I'm going to be talking about here. There are 2 ways generally of designing public services. On the left-hand side, you've got them to design around the way that we work, and legislation and policies that we define. And on the right hand side, you've got designing around citizens and their needs in the communities. And this is what we're going to explore in this video. As human learning systems provides a framework for these principles, concepts and methods of change. So this is actually how to make relational public services work. And they've been derived from evidence that allows us to understand how this actually works. It's not something that's just been designed and invented recently. And the way that I'm going to start in this case study is to use a 3-step process. The first step is understand, which is understanding how the current system works. Testing and learning, which is exploring and trying out different ways of working and seeing what works, and then actually finally creating the prototype. And you'll see this happening now in the case study. And the case study is housing allocations, which is where we supply housing for people in need. And this is social housing. The way that I start is that I've got a group of frontline people in the room, and we've been given permission to work in a different way to the rest of the organisation. And what I do on the first day is I ask them, what's the purpose of your service? And they say, well, it's to give people a house. And I spend the rest of the day understanding how this works, and we go into the work and we have a look, and we find that actually the demand that comes into the organisation comes in through a 14-page form. Now, that immediately starts to give me an understanding of how this has been designed, because I'm trying to understand what's the paradigm of the people that have designed this and the managers that manage this. And this is what's in my head. I've got a sausage machine, basically. You've got inputs, you've got processes, and you've got outputs. And this is a typical model that we see in manufacturing, but also we see it in the way that services are designed. And as I'm working with the team over several days, I also try and get an understanding of how the organisation works. And the way that I find is that actually we're all split up into separate departments with managers for each of those departments, and we have quite a lot of issues between those departments and the way that they work. But the key aspect of this is that control mechanisms and the way that we make this more efficient is by improving each one of these departments. So we start to go in and to have a look at how the work works in housing allocations, and we've got many demands that come in, people that need help, people that need to supply information, etc. And we find that actually there are 1 or 2 standard flows within the service that have been designed to take these demands and to process them. One of the things that we do first quite often is we look at the demands coming in, and we record those and we categorize those, and we understand that there are some demands which we will call value demands, the demands that we're here for, and we've got some demands which are failure demands, which are the ones that we, or the way that the design of our service has caused people to create those demands. And when we actually look at what the total quantity of those demands are, is that the failure demands are 62.7%. So that was the first indication that actually we have a significant amount of work that we have created in the way that we have designed the service. And this was not known to the current managers in the service at this time. And the next thing I then did is ask the team, so how, if you were a person in need of housing, how would you measure how well the service works? Now, what they immediately came up with was, well, it's actually from when I asked to be housed to when I am housed, end-to-end time. Now that sounds quite reasonable, But interestingly, that's not how they ever measured this. They measured it using KPIs that were averaged over a month and using measures that were defined by central government. So we had to spend quite some time digging up the data on this. And the way that it works in this organisation and in many such organisations is that they categorise people into 3 levels of priority: bronze, silver and gold. And what was absolutely fascinating to them was that although the bronze level of how long you had to be on the waiting list for was 655 days on average, with gold it was 675, and silver was even worse. So we started to realise that there was something not quite right here. And that was just the average. You can see that there was an upper control limit which demonstrated that there were many people that were waiting much longer. But more importantly, these were just the people that were housed. There were plenty of people that were sitting languishing on the waiting list for years. The next thing we did is that we went in to look at the flow. We looked at the flow from end to end. Now, no one in that room that I was working with actually had an end-to-end perspective. They were all departmentalized and just doing a certain part of the activity in the flow. So they all got together and we discovered that the flow itself consisted of 87 different steps. And then what we did is we asked the question, how many of these steps are value steps as defined by the people we're trying to help? And the answer was 7. So when you've got a difference between 87 and 7, that highlights that actually there's a scope for improvement, and there's actually a big gap between what are all these other things that we do that actually don't provide value. So these are all things that raise questions within the team. And what we also did is we had a look at a random 16 cases to go into more detail. We looked at the person's experience when they went through this process with us and what it was like. And in this case, typically it took a year from when this person submitted their application form to when it was actually approved and on the system, a whole 12 months. Again, that was something that the team had not realised. So what the team did is that I asked them to put the whole picture of how their system works on one slide. And I'm going to take you through this now so that we can understand what this actually looks like, how the whole service works. Forms come in either online or paper-based forms, and we have to match that up with the person whose records we have. We have to check that information, and we give them a banding based on what they've submitted. And if they submit a medical form, we need to check that, and if they don't agree with the banding that we've given them, they're allowed to appeal. And once the medical form has been analysed, we will potentially may change their banding. We then update their records and keep those records updated as they change their circumstances. But at each of these points, if there's anything wrong with their information, we have to send it back to them and they have to then resubmit. And they wait for the advertisement which comes through the system every 2 weeks, and they can bid on the properties that they see that they think are suitable for them. We then have to match and verify those properties. We then offer the person who's in most need the particular property, and they get that house. That's simple, isn't it? And that's how the great majority of housing allocations in the UK actually works. So the question I asked them, is this a good system? And how well is it helping people? And they didn't really know. They suspected that it could have some improvements made, but it was all a matter of bureaucracy and trying to smoothen this flow. So what we also did is have a look at a whole month's worth of data that was previously invisible to us. And we realized that, so we actually took real demands that came into the service for a period of a month, and we found that there were 285 demands that we came in for housing. 75% of those demands that came in had to be sent back because they were not correct or they needed changing. 95% of those were medical forms, And it took 6 months to process medical forms on average. And there were 27 appeals in that month. And we hated appeals because they took a really long time and they had to be done by a different team of people that were actually doing the assessments in the first place. And they took 7 months on average to do. There were over 6,000 people on the waiting list. 105 advertisements came in. 2,600 people bid. 35 people refused the properties that we offered them, and 87 people were housed. Now, we then asked the question again, is this a good system and how well is it helping people? And the answers were quite different at this point. So, I also asked them, so what's the purpose of this service now? The way that you feel that this purpose is. And what they said basically is that we process application forms and we actually have to make it difficult for people to get housing because we just don't have enough housing. So that's all we can do. We try our best. So we now completed the understand phase and we moved into the test and learn. And what test and learn is we got the same group of people and we were given permission to bypass all the policies and the processes that the organisation currently uses, and we don't need to use all the things that we currently use. We can decide ourselves how to do that, and instead we used a set of principles. And what happened is that we formed a bubble around ourselves where no one else was allowed to interfere with what we did. So we really had that open ability to liberate the team from the current restraints that they had. And the new set of principles were, we have to understand what matters. When a demand comes into that person, we make decisions based on knowledge and evidence, not opinions or standards. We only do what's needed to create value. Remember the 7 value steps, enabling the person to gain control of their lives. We take ownership through the end-to-end journey with the person. So instead of just dealing with individual activities that we used to do, we actually take responsibility for the whole end-to-end journey of that person. We work as a team without any departmental barriers, and we're here to learn. And rule number 1, we mustn't break the law. And rule number 2, we mustn't make that person's situation worse compared to how they would have been treated in the current system. And then we started to take real demands. This is what we ended up doing in terms of recording them. We recorded them on flip chart paper on the walls because we didn't know what we needed to record. We had to redesign that. We didn't know what we wanted to measure because, again, we were trying to find that out. So we were spending lots of time adjusting. And the way that we did this is that we would go first and listen to people, and we'd try different things out with each individual person, and then we would come back into the room and we would say to ourselves, what did we see, what did we learn, what are the implications for what happened when we tried these things out. And we did this as a whole team, and then we apply the new principles again, and we go round again and again and again. And this was a cycle of action learning that helped us to understand what worked and what didn't work. And we were working with people, and this was, I think, the second demand that we took. This was Agnes. She'd been already on the waiting list and she'd submitted recently a medical form. She lives in a bungalow with a garden and she wanted to move. And she said that on her application form, she said that she had problems walking. And we knew that actually she didn't really have much of a chance of getting a property because she wasn't in a great need. It was just, she was actually living quite comfortably where she was. And we had to help her to move. And we spent quite a lot of time actually trying to figure out what was going on with her because we could never really understand what it really was that really mattered to her. And we finally, after asking her several times, because in the current system, we never actually spoke to anybody. We only use forms and letters to communicate with people. So actually talking to people was new to the team. So what we actually found was that the house was perfect for her. The problem was the garden. She couldn't deal with the garden anymore because she couldn't walk properly. She didn't have the ability to go and kneel down and do all that. And she loved the garden. So this was a big thing for her. And she couldn't afford a gardener. So then the problem that we had to fix became something to do with a garden. And yes, it was. That's exactly what we ended up doing. And that was a real shock to the team because that's not what we were doing before. And after doing this with so many demands, we started to realize that this wasn't just about giving people housing and following a process. This was actually about helping people solve their housing problems. So a very different shift in purpose. And that was something that was very fundamental to the team and the manager and the director that was directing this. It was a real sea change in understanding. And it was a bit like when you've been working in a room for so long and you open the door and realize that actually what goes on outside of that room is very different to what you've been assuming and doing in that room. It was a real oh shit moment. And from all the people that we dealt with over a period of time, we found that 56% were not actually in housing need. 37% were in some need and 21% were in high need. And this was out of 35. Can you imagine that we dealt with all of these people, but we only needed to house 3 of the 35? Now that was the big shock that we had within the whole team in terms of what on earth were we doing with all the activity and the demands that were coming in. So they realized that the demand that came in was not what it seems. So we then shifted from the test and learn to the prototype to start develop the new system. And don't forget that during all of this time, we didn't write any reports. We were in that room and we brought senior decision makers into that room to learn from us. And they did that frequently and we did that directly. So they shadowed the team and they also had things that they then had to do and go and understand why the system was behaving this way. And this was most important to make this work. If we hadn't done that, then this whole exercise with human learning systems would not have achieved its outcomes that we're going to be showing you in a minute. So remember that this was the old workflow. What I'm going to show you now was what the new process was that they put in place. And don't forget, originally they're not allowed to talk to people. They had to do everything via documented communication. So the first thing they did is they insisted that the people would come in and talk to them. So they would sit with them and listen to what people had to say so that they could understand what matters to people. They asked them what they needed and they understood the whole context of their lives and their situation around them. We wrote those details on a sheet so that we could actually record that information. And together with them, while we were sitting with them, we would then assess their level of need and understand what the potential options were that they might be able to follow up with and to actually do themselves, and how we could help them to do that. And from that, we would actually house them, or we would help them for themselves to look for housing or sort out their housing problem. Now, what this does is that it demonstrates the shift from a transactional to a relational design. And this is the core of what relational public service design actually is. The difference between the flowchart that we showed you before, which was bureaucratic, mechanistic and standardized, to this one, which is flexible. Each time someone sits down with a team, we do it differently. We have a different demand, and the activities and the options that we do will be different to each person. And some will take shorter, some will take longer. And in many cases, we won't help people because they're actually not in need. And before, we would have put everybody on the waiting list. So basically, we ended up focusing just on the value steps, which is perfect, which is really getting rid of all that other bureaucracy that we just didn't need to do anymore. So we ended up shifting from using all of this technology and processes and rules, and we ended up using, in the prototype at least, an A4 sheet of paper where we would record all the information down. And on the left-hand side, you see the guides as to what questions we should be asking. And then on the other side of the piece of paper, it carried on that way. So this is how we operationalize the test and learn when we actually use everything manually and develop it manually and then go to the technology. And this was the new list, the new waiting list that we were starting to create. So, did this cost more? Was this a better way of working? Did it create better outcomes? This was most important in terms of going back to up to 2 years later and discovering what the outcomes were compared to the original way of working. The original waiting list was over 6,000, and after 2 years, the waiting list had dropped to 309. 30% of the demand that was satisfied in the old system increased to 80% of demand that was satisfied. We were able to help directly 80% of the people that came to us. There was 62.7% failure demand. In the new system, there was 3% failure demand. We were using 3 IT systems before, and 2 years later, they were just developing the new one single IT system that was actually going to help them to do this. 27 appeals a month, which they hated doing, created lots of work. There was 1 appeal in 1 year. Advertising cost, we didn't need that anymore. There was a cost reduction, 25%. And instead of people being aggressive and frustrated, and we can understand why, because of all the delays and the classifications in the old system, we were there to actually help people. And in terms of how it was working for the staff, which was quite demoralizing, they ended up being very motivated because they could see that they were actually helping people directly and they were making an impact in the communities and in society. There was an unknown cost originally as to what the impact was in communities, and now the team had developed true links with other groups. They had connected with voluntary agencies and community groups and used those to help deal with some of the problems that many of these people came with. And before, that just didn't happen. Not only that, they didn't even link up with other parts of the public sector. And in this new way of working, they would be able to go to anyone in the public sector and be able to say, can you help me? I've got this person here that needs some support. There were 22 people working there. Is this going to cost more or less? Well, in fact, in just this particular part of the service, we didn't need that many people as much anymore. And this was at the very beginning of austerity. So this type of reduction in staff is not going to be realised if we did this today. And the other last thing is that this service was actually creating dependency on the public sector before. And what this did now was that it gives responsibility back to the citizens for also them to start seeing what it is that they can do to make their lives better and to look around themselves and to start not just using the public sector as a way to get support to do that. Right, now let's have a look at the graphs of the drop in the waiting list over time. It took 2 years for the blue line, which is the organisation I was working with, for that waiting list to drop down, because we had to go through everybody on the waiting list to understand what their needs were. We didn't just throw them off the waiting list. Central government came and had a look at us because we weren't doing what they were expecting us to do, and they realised that actually this was learning that they could take into the new ways of working across the nation. So they developed guidance that actually was then helping other local authorities to act in a similar way to what they were doing in Yarmouth. But it wasn't the same. It was just taking some of the aspects. And this is a very important point about relational public services. It's not just about copying what one organisation does and thinking that's what we do. It's about understanding how that change happened and actually make it happen in other parts of the public sector as well. So you can see here, although it did have an impact, it did not have the same impact as it did in Yarmouth. One thing we did find when you do this across different services is that there are different types of services that require different types of designs. There are the simplistic, simple and transactional services. I want to pay, I need a new driving license. There are simple but many different types with high variation, like licensing, where they have to license a whole myriad of different types of groups. And you've got ones that require expertise, like planning in terms of, can I build the house this way, or can I do this to my property? And then you've got the last one, which is the complex, and we need to understand people. And this is kind of like the more help me type of services. And what's really interesting is that from a systems thinking perspective, each service has different characteristics, and each one has to be approached differently in terms of redesigning it and what the final design looks like. The majority of cost in the public sector lies within which one of those? That's actually the most interesting question. Because when you actually look at the costs in the public sector, you find that the number 4, the complex ones, which is about helping to support those people in our communities that need support to help them get their lives back in control. You find that the costs associated with people in that situation are far higher than anybody else. And this is talking about health and well-being, supporting people back into work, caring for others, housing, and just those times in our lives when we just can't cope anymore. And that encompasses health, and it usually encompasses the police and any other parts of the public sector that are to do with helping people. And what we find is that it's in particular that arena where the increased demands and increased costs are in the public sector. And you can see that in this example, we've used a service that is actually complex. It was actually designed as a simple and transactional service, but it actually was a complex one. And that was the reason why it was so difficult for the people working there to actually make that an efficient and effective service. Now, can you imagine when you apply the logic of making something more efficient? Let's say by not talking to people, but by just asking for forms that come into the organization. You think, well, that's going to be much more efficient than individually talking to each individual person, because it's going to save time for my staff. And in some cases, if the service was simple and transactional, that may well be true. But when a service is complex, actually trying to make efficiencies in that way create far more problems in that service than it's trying to deal with. So applying the types of concepts and methods that you would use in a service design for a simple and transactional service into a complex service actually means that you end up increasing costs and increasing demands. That's what we've found when we've looked at this through a human learning systems lens. When we work this way, and it's a core part of human learning systems, it's not just about redesigning the process. As you can see now, it's far greater than that. But not only that, we have to involve managers and senior decision makers in this team as well, because that's the way that we understand that the whole system has to change. Because it's only the managers and the senior decision makers that can make that senior change happen across the system. Relational public services provide responsive methods designed to deal with complexity, dealing with the multiple needs of people rather than individually fixing single issues by separate transactional services. They're designed around what matters to people. They comprise of a multidisciplinary approach that allows for flexible ways of working, where local government staff can mobilise themselves dynamically to work with people and other organisations at a local neighbourhood level, where frontline staff engage with people in a way that allow people themselves to decide where and how to begin their journey back to a balanced life. It's less about delivering services and more about supporting, with staff able to make the right decisions at the right time. Relational working utilises strengths inherent in our communities and the voluntary sector, using techniques that recognise the complex systemic nature of supporting people. This is not new. Many local government agencies have been working in this way around the world. But we and others have got together to pool our learning, and that is what became human learning systems, which I'm going to talk to you about now. When working in complex environments, staff are required to work in direct relation with each other. When designing services, the optimal design starts with the person and what matters to them. This means using measures to understand value and how we can create it. Learning. Staff are required to continually learn from each other. When designing services, the optimal design is derived through an ongoing process of testing, learning and adaptation. This means using measures to learn rather than control. Reflective practice between and across peer groups. So learning becomes a central part of the culture of the organisation and the way that managers and senior decision makers make decisions on how their organisation and the roles within it should be designed. And then there's systems. Understanding systems thinking and complexity, looking at the whole, working as a network, understanding the purpose of why we're here and how to create value, shifting from designing around a hierarchy and vertical management to designing across departments with managers supporting horizontally across the organisation. When we look at efficiencies and making things more effective, we start with a whole first rather than go into the detail and try and make each individual thing more effective and more efficient. So, summarising really, the reform of public services requires a shift to an outside-in perspective from the citizen's perspective, and it's a design focused on purpose and what matters to people in their communities. Well, I hope this video has been useful for you. Thank you very much.